The ranchers of one of the Australian Outback's remotest cattle stations were unprepared for the sight that met them as they drove along a rutted dirt track. They stopped 300 feet away, recoiling at the sight of a bearded, living skeleton shambling towards them. His skin was blistered, cracked, and blackened by the sun. He tried to articulate a plea for help, but his parched vocal cords could only produce the feeblest of whispers. His skin was drawn so tight that almost every bone in his body could be counted. Only his eyes retained a glimmer of human vitality. Then he told his devastating story. Introducing himself as Ricky Megee, he recounted an incredible struggle for survival. He had been drugged, robbed, buried, and left for dead in the Australian Outback. For 71 days he roamed through the desert, surviving by eating frogs, leeches, and grasshoppers. In January 2006, 35-year-old Ricky Megee was starting over. He had a new job with the Australian government's employment service in Port Hedland, located on the northwest coast, 3,000 miles from his home in Brisbane. On a scorching summer day, he climbed into his old Mitsubishi 4x4, feeling hopeful about the new road ahead. Several days and thousands of dusty miles later, Ricky was driving west on the Buntine Highway, just before the border between the Northern Territory and Western Australia. It was a lonely part of a vast, empty land. The rainy season had just ended, leaving many roads muddy and impassable. Even the ranchers had left the large cattle stations, waiting for better weather. Ricky hadn't seen another soul for a long time. As he drove, his mind drifted to the future. Suddenly he saw something surprising. 3 Aboriginal men standing by the road next to a car. Few traveled the Buntine in January. The road was mostly dirt and often washed out in the wet season. Ricky knew they'd be stuck in the sun if he didn't stop. He pulled up a safe distance away and signaled one of them over. He kept all his doors locked and windows up except for the front passenger side. The man explained they were out of fuel and needed a lift to Halls Creek. Ricky let him in, gave him a cold beer, and they set off. 20 minutes later, as they crossed the edge of the western desert, Ricky was out of beer. The passenger opened another for him. 10 minutes later, Ricky felt groggy and his vision warped. He'd driven after a few beers before, but this was different. They were still hours from Halls Creek. Despite his swerving, his passenger seemed unconcerned. Ricky didn't remember much after that. When he opened his eyes, he was in the passenger seat of his parked car on a dirt highway. He got out and heard voices behind some bushes, which fell silent as he approached. He turned back to the car and got into the driver's seat. As he was about to hit the gas, he saw a figure. The man leapt onto the footstools. Ricky floored it, trying to shake him off, but the man held on. Using a rock, the man smashed the back window. They fought as the car bumped along at 60 miles per hour. Eventually, they crashed into some bushes. Ricky got out, disoriented, and saw the figure running into the darkness. Still affected by the drugs and exhausted, he collapsed into the grass. Hours later, Ricky sat by the road, disoriented. People rummaged through his car. A young Aboriginal man handed him a bottle of water, telling him to stay quiet. Thirsty and with nothing to lose, Ricky drank and passed out again. Ricky regained consciousness to the smell of earth, his face pressed against the dirt with a weight on his back. He kicked and fought until he was free, realizing he was in a shallow grave, covered by plastic and held down by rocks. Dazed and dizzy, it took him half an hour to understand his dire situation. He had been drugged, robbed, and buried. His car was gone. He was dressed only in a t-shirt and shorts, missing his shoes, socks, cigarettes, and lighter. The cracked desert stretched out in all directions, with only a few twisted trees offering scant shade. He didn't know where he was, only that it was a desert, and it was hot. Hungry, thirsty, and still groggy from the drugs, Ricky forced himself to focus. He climbed a tree to look around, but the landscape was unfamiliar. He headed for the nearest hill to get a better view. From the top, he saw nothing new. No road, no house, no people. Using the sun, he decided west was the best direction, hoping to find a highway. The desert was brutal. Hours into his trek, he doubted his direction, fearing he might be heading deeper into the desert. So he turned back east, hoping to find a road or river leading to civilization. The heat was relentless. Ricky soon realized he needed to drink his own urine to survive. He used his underwear to catch and squeeze it into his mouth. Worse than the urine was walking without shoes. The hot, rocky ground tore at his feet, leaving them sore and bleeding. That night he built a shelter from branches and nestled by some bushes, trying to sleep. By midnight, a small storm passed, and he managed to collect some water, cupping his hands to drink as much as he could. For days, Ricky wandered the desert, chasing rain clouds and drinking his urine. Roads were nowhere to be found. He stumbled, weighed down by dehydration. Finding water became his only goal. He found wet mud and scraped out precious drops. He followed wet patches that turned into puddles, then channels, and finally, a river. The river was a lifeline, promising water and eventually civilization. Ricky dove in, drinking his fill, feeling a surge of gratitude for whatever had led him there. One moment he was dying. The next, he was in the river with fresh water easing his troubles. Ricky waded into the river, hoping it would be easier on his torn feet. However, the river had its own dangers. Underwater branches and barbed wire cut into his skin, and the inconsistent depth forced him to alternate between swimming and wading. Despite these challenges, it was better than the scorching ground. After drifting downstream for hours, he rounded a bend and saw a decrepit windmill. It gave him hope. Perhaps someone would come. He swam to the river's edge and crawled out, feeling confident. He decided to camp there, thinking rescue was imminent. But the nights were cold and the days were filled with torment. Mosquitoes swarmed him relentlessly, driving him to jump into the river for relief. He built a shelter from mud away from the windmill and river, hoping to escape the mosquitoes. It helped somewhat, but he couldn't avoid them entirely. Rain provided water, but food was scarce. Grass was his only nourishment, and he consumed as much rain-soaked grass as he could. But it did nothing to alleviate his hunger. Nights grew colder, and hunger gnawed at him. The river's water was a blessing, but the mosquitoes tormented him continuously. He had to choose: stay and risk starvation, or leave and hope for rescue. Days passed, and Ricky couldn't bear it any longer. He left the shelter and followed the river, seeking a farmhouse, a homestead, anything. Using boards from the windmill, he made a raft and built an SOS sign from the windmill blades. It was time to take the risk and float away. He drifted downstream, hoping for a sign of civilization. Hours later, he saw a path. He paddled to the river's edge, feeling relieved. Signs of life gave him hope. He left the raft, taking a gamble, and followed the path. After a few hours, he considered turning back, but then found a main path. The landscape was still desolate, but it seemed more promising. Driven by a will to survive, he walked for miles and finally found a fence with gates. Civilization, maybe. He passed through, hopeful but wary. The road was long, and he drank from dugouts tainted with cow feces. His feet bled, but he pressed on. However, nothing but empty farmland greeted him. As the sun set, Ricky rolled in cow dung and grass to keep warm and fend off mosquitoes, but it didn't work. The next morning, he walked for hours in the relentless heat. When the road forked, a sign read, "Among the yards one way and Boree the other." Thinking that yards might mean people, he turned right. Hours later, he found only an empty cattle yard. Defeated, He walked back to the intersection and spelled SOS with rocks, hoping a plane might see it. Hunger gnawed at him. Searching for food, he found a dead tree. Without hesitation, he reached inside and felt the pinch of a bush centipede. The pain was excruciating, shooting up his arm and causing it to swell. As the sun set, the pain worsened. His feet bled, but desperation drove him on. Then he saw lights in the distance, thinking they were car headlights. He ran, screaming for help, hitting fences and tripping over rocks, but he kept going. The lights vanished. Realizing they were not car lights, but a storm lightning on the horizon, he collapsed by a tree, miserable. Raindrops woke him the next day. His arm no longer stung. He was alive but lost, having not eaten properly in 10 days. The hunger pains grew as the centipede bite's pain subsided. Eating grass and roots wasn't enough. Blood poured from his feet. He wrapped them in his shirt for padding. The dirt pounded under 120 degrees. There was no escape from the heat. Night brought freezing cold, so he built a shelter from mud, grass, and cow manure. He woke and kept walking. Thirst gripped him. He prayed for rain. Drinking rainwater felt like winning the lottery, keeping him alive another day. The next day, thirst gripped him again. Remembering a TV program about finding water under certain black rocks, he spotted those rocks and decided to try. He walked a few hundred yards to the bottom of a hill and dug furiously, finding muddy water. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. He buried his face in the pool, filtering out the mud with his teeth, laughing at his newfound bush survival skills. With enough fluids, he moved on. He walked another half-mile and saw a big green mound. As he got closer, he saw a dam, overflowing. Days of drinking stagnant water and walking with cut-up feet convinced him to stay there. The dam was surrounded by vegetation, frog holes, and crab tracks. The water felt fresh, like a gift from God. After drinking his fill, Ricky dug into the side of the dam, creating a 3-foot-deep hole to sleep in. He hoped this would help him escape the mosquitoes that had tormented him since he got lost in the desert. He found metal scraps around the dam, which proved better for digging than sticks and his hands. Over the next few days, with water and vegetation nearby, he expanded his hole, lining it with grass. Now, he worried about storms. If they hit, the mud roof might collapse and bury him alive. He ate crickets, grasshoppers, and mud crabs from the dam. Leeches were easy to catch. He would swim out, let them latch on, then peel them off and eat them. Sometimes they bit his tongue, so he learned to chew fast. He also ate ants, wasps, and mosquitoes, but stopped, fearing Ross River fever. Planes occasionally flew overhead, but he could never signal them. The dam's water dwindled without rain, and Ricky had consumed almost everything around him. He had to move on, leaving the shelter he had built. The unseen plains drove him to this decision. He packed his pockets with vegetation and walked on. The desert heat drained him, and thoughts of his old shelter haunted him. But then he found another dam with a cow trough he used as a cover for a new shelter. This dam had frogs for meat. He caught and dried them in the sun. Days passed. Ricky heard a plane and saw it this time. He jumped on the trough, waved a branch, and screamed. He saw the pilot, but the plane flew over him. Despite this, he believed he would be rescued here. The dam had fewer leeches and no crabs, his favorite foods, but enough vegetation to sustain him. Weeks went by. Ricky lived on what the dam offered. Sure, someone would come. The leeches vanished, and frogs became scarce. At first, he could catch 5 or 6 large frogs easily, then only 2 or 3 small ones with great effort. He realized he had eaten the reproducing adults, so he let the remaining frogs breed and ate vegetation instead. His weight dropped quickly. His fingers became too thin to hold water, and his eyelids wouldn't shut properly. Ricky knew he was starving. He made a small cross above his shelter to mark his body if he died. An old one-eyed dingo visited occasionally, providing a strange comfort, though Ricky knew it was waiting for an easy meal. Desperation grew. He tried to eat cockroaches, but couldn't stomach them. The dingo came more often, and Ricky contemplated eating it, but ultimately decided against it. One morning, he found 4 other dingoes waiting for him. They circled but didn't attack, posing a new threat. Ricky spent days in his shelter, blocking the entrance with rocks. Eventually, the dingoes left. After the dingoes, Ricky faced another danger. One morning, he woke with pain on the left side of his face. He couldn't open his mouth and suspected a spider bite. It was worse. Large, pus-filled blisters had formed around his gums, indicating an abscessed tooth, something that wouldn't go away on its own and could be fatal if ignored. He found some wire used for skewering frogs and put it in his mouth, shredding the blisters. His mouth filled with black blood and pus, and he nearly vomited. With the blisters gone, he felt the rotten tooth wiggling. It was time to deal with it. With tears in his eyes, he hooked the wire under the loose part of the tooth and pulled with all his remaining strength. The tooth detached with a ripping sound. The pain persisted, and eating was still excruciating. He could consume small amounts but found it too painful to move his jaw. For 5 days he dealt with tooth pain in his shelter. When he finally tried to walk, he fell. A swim in the dam helped him regain his balance. After a couple of days, one late afternoon, Ricky lay in his shelter, having given up all hope of surviving. The wind whistled through the holes as usual, mimicking the sound of a car. Ricky, accustomed to its torturous mockery, usually ignored it until the wind changed gear. The sound was unmistakable, a sudden pitch shift that could only come from a real car. Scarcely daring to believe it, Ricky tore his way out of his shelter and ran towards the noise. His legs instantly gave way, and he fell face first down the steep embankment of the waterhole. He got to his knees and staggered, crawled, and hauled himself towards the 2 astonished ranchers who were just getting out of their vehicle. The ranchers had been exploring the desolate country when they spotted something moving in the distance, unfamiliar and odd. As they drew closer, they saw him. A walking skeleton. Ricky waved, jumping up and down. The 2 farmhands stopped and approached him. They introduced themselves, and Ricky whispered that he had been left for dead in the desert on January 24th. They told him it was April 4th. Ricky had spent 71 days lost in the Australian Outback. They took him to the homestead, where the nurse was horrified by his condition. She gave him fruit and pumpkin soup, explaining that he needed to be gradually reintroduced to solid food. The next day, he was flown to Darwin Hospital. When Ricky Megee had entered the wilderness, he weighed 230 pounds. By the time he reached the hospital, he was down to 105. The doctors and police doubted his story, saying no man could lose that much weight and survive. As Ricky recovered, he demonstrated to the officials how he had managed to survive. His fortune lay in the season. It was the wet season. Any other time, he would have perished, like many who vanish in Australia's outback every year. As Ricky slowly regained his health, he documented his harrowing experience in a book titled Left for Dead: How I Survived 71 Days in the Outback. He then emigrated to Dubai to pursue a career in construction. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your time and hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to check out the other great content on our channel. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.